abolish the idea that people with disabilities are a cost or a liability. Sometimes they see you only need to do what's required by the regulation. So there's some of that ableist thinking that's out there, right? And that is part of the work that I have to do. And the work we all have to do is challenge people's thinking. I not only have to provide access for people with disabilities, I also have to change the mindset of people without disabilities because they're often the decision makers. They're the providers of accessibility systems and built environments and all of that. So I would love to abolish that attitude. I don't think it'll get done completely, but that is the thing I will work on as well.
Welcome to Sustainable Futures with Daniela Bas, where innovation meets impact. Join me every first and the third Saturday at 10 a.m. Central European Time for engaging conversations with visionaries reshaping industries like fashion, tech, tourism, sports, and more through social fairness and sustainability. As a global leader and change maker, I share fresh insights and actionable ideas to inspire meaningful change and drive results. Tune in, subscribe, and help shape a brighter, sustainable future. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, in whichever part of the world you are. My guest today is Ronald Pettit, who drives transformative strategies that refine inclusivity in the travel industry. And his story is one I would like you to listen, and you must not miss it. Hello, welcome, Ron.
Hello, Daniela. It's great to be here today.
Tell us, what's something on your bucket list that has nothing to do with work or advocacy, but says everything about who you are?
Something fun about me that I think would people love to know is I'm an airline geek. I've always been fascinated by air travel and I've always wanted to work for an airline. You can see the airline posters in my home office here, and it's been my dream to work for an airline. So I worked toward that goal my entire life, and I even went to a college called Bridgewater State University in South Shore of Massachusetts for the aviation program. And then after that, I graduated from college and went right to work for Northwest Airlines and started living the dream, being in air travel and working at Boston Logan Airport. And then eventually, it was at Northwest Airlines when I moved to the headquarters in Minneapolis. I became passionate about making air travel accessible. So that's where my story got started.
All right. So you have heard that Ronald Pettit is a pioneer in travel, and I would add accessible travel after nearly 2 decades, this time not dealing with aviation, but with the sea, that is with Royal Caribbean, where, he refined what inclusive tourism looks like. From launching the first global cruise initiative for, I would say, millions of people with autism to hosting history making all death voyages. So Petit turned policy into action, into progress. He doubled guest engagement, steered multi-million dollar budgets, and earned accolades like best places to work for disability inclusion, setting a new industry standards. So my question is to you, how did you balance profitability with social responsibility in developing scalable inclusive programs for companies you worked for, either in aviation or cruises or else? And this was also part of your personal experiences. How did you balance these two?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and I think, part of that starts off with the conversation around, being an advocate, right? I'm not only an advocate for my guests, I'm also an advocate for my company. And I learned that throughout the years. Like, a few years back, I was a community advisor for a leadership program here in Broward County in South Florida for the Center for Independent Living. And it was a leadership program for people with disabilities to teach them how to become advocates, whether it's personally or professionally. So Part of that is all around advocacy and how do we create change and how do we make the world a better place um, for ourselves and for others. And so you mentioned the autism friendly program. That's kind of like, the initiative that I'm most proud of, and that talked about, creating scalable programs. We started somewhere. When I started thinking about making cruising more autistic friendly, it was a learning opportunity and an experience because at the time I didn't know what autism was. You kind of see the stereotypes about autism and say, how can this fit in with cruises? So I worked together with a company called Autism on the Seas, and we began to understand, we've been catering to families with autism on our cruise ship for years, but they were more of the higher functioning end of the spectrum and kind of the opportunity to figure out what the challenges are and what products and services that we had to combat that. For example, priority boarding, priority check-in, gluten-free meals, and a whole host of things that we really then took the opportunity to pull all that together and create the world's first autistic-friendly cruise line. And that really kind of showed that we could be socially responsible and create, sustainable, accessible cruising, but also profitably, right? It was one of the few programs that I could really clearly show the dramatic increase in number of guests with autism and their families sailing with us. And that was really an eye-opening experience, not only for me, but for our company, and realizing that, accessibility is not just a cost or a liability, but actually a profit center.
How did you manage to um, convince the company to try and then see that there were real good results, as you said, also from a profit perspective?
Well, I think that I was lucky at my company that they trusted me. What I do now is I'm more data driven. Back then, I wasn't as data driven as I am now. And when we launched the program, we started counting the number of guests with autism. We've never done that before. And I said we needed to do that so we could show how many more customers are we getting, what the revenue attached to those guests are there, and and also show all the companion revenue that's happening. Because if this guest with autism didn't sail, their family, friends, and companions would not sail at all because they are not going to be able to sail. So I mean, it was not difficult to convince because I think that one of the things is that everybody knows somebody on the spectrum. It's really kind of eye opening when I give talks around this topic. I say, "How many of you know somebody on the spectrum?" And almost everybody is like half the room raises their hands, and that is really the great experience because then I say, "Hey, okay, I don't have to talk to you guys now. I have to convince the other people." But I think it's really important because people do have this universal desire to um, be kind and be helpful. Um, and sometimes we talk about the motivation, saying it's the right thing to do. But I always have to balance it out. It's not only just the right thing to do, it makes good business sense. It is profitable. Again, this goes back to where I'm an advocate not only for the guests, but for a company. At the end of the day, we've got to make money. Otherwise, there's not a company at all. And so, and I think one of the ways to talk about convincing leaders about things, you have to also think about where their motivations are, whether they think about, hey, it's the right thing to do, or they're just concerned about making a buck. So you have to kind of address all those different points of views and meet the leaders where they are.
So, what are the governance blind spots in major travel brands and their leaders when it comes to disability inclusion and equity? From your perspective, you have such a vast experience working with major companies.
I think this is true of anything that people do at companies. They have to look at their audience, understand the audience, and learn what their motivations are. Um, if they're concerned about the right thing to do, it make good business sense, it's going to make money. Sometimes it's really helpful when the leader has a personal connection. And that is really what drives a lot of things. Like I remember the leader at Microsoft, his son was in a wheelchair. He's passed now, but
Yeah.
it drove him to make Microsoft and the world a better place because of his son. And I think when people have those experiences, it sparks them to do it's a little trendy statement to be a force for good, but really that's what it is. And you have to harness those motivations into getting you buy-in, what you're doing and moving forward. So again, what I have to do is figure out how to position things in multiple ways so that as I talk to different groups of people, I'm approaching them where they are.
So, by using this method, you have seen scalable success. So, which inclusive practices actually work in your view, and why aren't they adopted industry wide?
Well, I think, one of the things that has been really helpful for me and is a really inclusive practice is about I'm very big on collaboration. So over the years, I have created processes to get um, guest feedback. And I started this at Northwest Airlines when I created the customer advisory board. And we were the first major airline to have a permanent advisory board on disabilities. In fact, we got a couple of awards for our initiatives. We were like touted by the DOT to other airlines about, hey, Northwest Airlines is doing this and you should be doing it too. And so now almost every airline has some sort of advisory board. And that all started when I did the first one. And I've done that at Caribbean, but it took me 10 years before I created an advisory board because it was a different need. I didn't need an advisory board to get feedback right away, but I think it leveraged well in terms of community outreach and all of that. And the great thing about the advisory boards that I've done is a cross disability advisory board. So there's multiple different disabilities and multiple different experiences. But at Royal Caribbean, I created other advisory boards, one on autism, because we're an autism-friendly cruise line. So I created a special advisory board to help us with that topic. And then I created an advisory board about travel agents. That one, most of our cruises are sold by travel agents. And so we wanted to partner with travel agents, many of them who specialize in accessible travel or cruising. And so, um, and that is one way to be collaborative, to get the community, disability community involved in your process. There's other ways to get feedback. We look at comment cards, complaint letters, we do focus groups. We even leverage our own internal employee resource groups for feedback as well. I did it at Northwest before we called them employee resource groups. That's how long
Mhm.
ago it was. Um, but that's one of the ways that I talk about being inclusive. It's include people in the process, um, and and it's also important to include people with disability on your team. So when I started at Royal Caribbean, I started with 7 people, and now and it became 50 people. And a
Wow.
lot of that's because of our accessibility contact center, right? We have a contact center that helps our guests and travel partners plan accessible cruise vacations and shore excursions. But I had a small disability inclusion team, and most of them had a disability. I am hard of hearing, um, and I had a young lady who was a wheelchair user. I had someone who's blind, and really having those folks on my accessibility team also created firsthand lived experiences as part of our process. So that's how some of the things that I made sure that we would be inclusive because we were including people with disabilities, not only my team, but in terms of guest and employee feedback.
If fairness were a cruise destination, what's one practice every business should pack in their itinerary?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, part of the answer is that I was going to share with you today was about, this desire for accessible suites. So we have accessible staterooms and a percentage of them were suites. But at Royal Caribbean, we've got a multi-tiered suite program with different levels, and not all this. There's not a suite in every level, and so guests were asking for more accessible suites. Typically we had like two, and then I think some ships got three. As I left, we were on a roadmap to build more, like four or five accessible suites, at least one at each tier. Um, I was so excited when Icon of the Seas came out because that was the first ship to have an accessible suite at the top level that came with Genie service. Genie service is an amazing personalized service that literally makes any wish come true. I mean, within reason.
Yeah.
uh, and but it was an amazing experience. And talking about fairness, it's about building out a product that all of the products and services are available to our guests with disability, and not just junior suites. Now there's suites at each level that they can have access. It's also a great thing to think about when people think about the disability market. They don't always think about disability market as a market with money, right? It's built around obviously the fact that many people with disabilities are still unemployed, and that's a whole nother topic for another day. But the perception is, oh yeah, they're only going to want inside staterooms. No, more people with disabilities are getting jobs. More people with disabilities are getting executive jobs. But the other thing you think about is the person with disability, it may not be the purchaser in the
Hmm.
equation. Their companion, their spouse. Maybe there's a family member, grandma, who has the money, and
They could
they're
have won the
buying the cruise.
lottery. Yes.
and so and so really you have to convince two people. One, you have to convince the person with disability the cruise is successful, which that's easy. I've done that. And then two, make sure that the person who's buying the cruise believes in that, right? And all of that. So there's a little bit a lot to think about, but it goes back to the whole idea of fairness and equitability, about thinking about what is our product and services and how do we make it available to all of our guests.
Now let's talk about something a teeny bit uncomfortable. What uncomfortable truths needed to be said out loud if we want real inclusion in tourism, Ron, from your perspective, your experience?
It's stop thinking about the disability market as a limitation or a liability cost. Think of it as an opportunity. Think people with disabilities are already there, whether they or not. Um, One of the things that statistically, they're like whatever number you use, 85% of people who have hidden. I don't like the word hidden because you're really not hiding your disability, but it's not
Invisible.
apparent. It's not
Yes.
apparent.
Yes.
Um, so there's a lot of people with disabilities that are traveling, and they have non-apparent disability, and a lot of times they don't need help, right?
Hmm.
We have a numbers of guests with disabilities that we know about, but those are the people that need accommodations or adjustments for their vacation or a holiday. And a lot of times internally when I have conversations, there's always a talk around cost. Like how much things cost, and they equate it back to as the individual guest level, and they say, well, we're losing money when we carry this type of guest. And we position say, well, the cost needs to be built into your overhead, not against the single guest with disability over 5,000 guests you have on your cruise ship, right?
Hmm.
Then it becomes $1 or two per guest. It's still a cost, but it's a lot less. And it's a more equitable comment. That's one of the reasons why I had to go back and show how many guests with disabilities we were carrying, and the revenue attached, all the companion stuff. What it still was a work in progress, still something to think about, is the older market. There's never been a really good term, the mature seniors. Um, but there's a group of people like, hey, over 60, 65, 70, whatever age bracket you use, that use all the same accessibility services, but they don't like to be labeled as disabled. So it
Yeah,
part of it is a marketing and communication language, but that is also a strategy that I've heard some of my counterparts and some companies have used to figure out how do we grow up not only the disability market but also the aging market and put them together and say this is
exactly.
everybody that we're targeting for accessibility. And then in that way, it's a much larger conversation with leaders and say, hey, it's not a 3% number. It's a 10, 15% number, and it's a lot more meaningful to have these type of conversations and then say, okay, I need money to to do that. And I don't need a lot of money. I'm like, I do things with sweat equity, and I think there's ways to get things done if you spend what money you have wisely and as well as other ways to get it done. So those are the things that I would think about when you talk about some of the challenge of unlocking access to the disability market.
Now, let's move to the second part of this wonderful conversation and let's talk about the past. Once upon a time, what made Ronald realize accessibility wasn't just a job, but it was your mission?
You know, when I think about the past and the history and how everything has evolved over time, I look back and I think about my time at Northwest when I started working on disability issues in terms of making air travel accessible for people with disabilities. It sort of awakened my passion for making travel accessible. I love to fly. I'm an airline geek at heart. And I just really at that time was thinking like air travel should be accessible to all. And that's where I got started. And also, I started the advisory board and working with the disability community there. I began to realize that I came into an identity of a person with a disability. I never labeled myself as someone with disabled. It's like wearing glasses. And so I started to talk more about being a person with a disability and looking at my challenges. And that really evoked understanding in the people I was talking to because most of the time when we think about disability, we think about wheelchair users. And when I started talking about hearing loss and what I had to go through, they said, Ron, I never thought about it that way. And it kind of opened their eyes and ears and an idea that we can be inclusive of all disabilities, all abilities,
Right, so that was your aha moment in the past. Now
right?
let's move to the present. Tell us more about some of the things happening in inclusive travel today and what's trending.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned that while I was at Northwest, I started the first permanent airline advisory board on disability, and that continues today. I see more and more airlines and travel companies having advisory boards of people with disabilities. I think just recently, British Airways and Virgin Atlantic have created advisory boards, and this is really a great way to include people with disabilities in the process. It's a great way to get the guest's voice in the process and really learn how to be more inclusive. So I think that including people with disabilities is the trend today. And the other thing I look back also is I built the world's first autistic friendly program at a cruise line, and that was over 10 years ago. And we were actually like one of the first travel companies to be doing that. And that is still, I don't like to say autism travel is a trend, but it is because more and more companies are being inclusive of people on the spectrum as well as their families. I think my foray into inclusive autism travel really started to think about not just counting or talking about people with disabilities, but also their family and friends that travel with them. And that is the true power of the disability market.
At the airport in Dubai, actually, they're providing amazing services, as you said, also to family members. They even provide free courses for families and their relatives who might have autism within the airport to familiarize with what's happening at the airport, how you embark, and so on and so forth. Very interesting. Yes, it's trendy,
Yeah,
as you said, and
yeah.
hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, and the many airports and airlines have created those familiarization tours, and we did that too at the cruise line, and created tours for people on the spectrum and their families to tour the terminal, the cruise ship, to see what a cruise experience would look like for someone on the spectrum. You were just mentioning airports, and there's also what's trending is companies kind of going vertical in terms of what I see like at Royal Caribbean, where I was at most recently, they not only built accessible cruise ships, but now they're building accessible land experiences. They have private destinations, and they have two, and they're expanding to four, like beach clubs in the Bahamas and Mexico, and additional private destinations in the South Pacific. And all of that also has to be accessible. The goal that we had was really kind of taking the accessible experience on the ship and pushing it out to the land so they got a consistent, accessible experience for their entire vacation holiday.
So I see we're moving towards a beautiful vision. And now, talking about a vision and the future, I would like to know your vision. Imagine you were 20 years old in 2071, designing the future of travel from scratch. So, what would you build first and what would you abolish forever?
I think the first thing I would do is leverage technology. If you're talking 2071, technology is going to be in a different place than it is today. And there are going to be things that we can do, especially like with AI, that's so new today, and we're still learning about how to incorporate AI into everything, really. I mean, I'm remembering back when I got started, and it's look back to the past really quickly. And when I was at Northwest, we worked with a wheelchair service provider, and we said, what if we could push the guest information to push a level? So what happened at the time was really the idea that the gate agent would call for a pusher. They come to the gate, and they don't know anything about the guest. They don't know their name. They don't know where they're going. Are they going to baggage claim? Are they taking a connecting flight? What's that flight number? What time is it leaving? Is it leaving in 15 minutes? It's leaving in 3 hours. They didn't have any of that information. And so we got to the point where we pushed all that information via Palm Pilots. Remember that? And Palm Pilots are gone now. No, we have smartphones. I mean, technology is evolving to a great pace. We didn't have cell phones until a few decades. There are things that we can do for our accessible guests today, and I can only imagine what will happen tomorrow. What I would abolish forever, I think what I would love to do is think about abolish the idea that people with disabilities are a cost or a liability. You know, sometimes they see we only need to do what's required by the regulation, right? So there's some of that ableist thinking that's out there. And that is part of the work that I have to do. And the work we all have to do is challenge people's thinking. I not only have to provide access for people with disabilities, I also have to change the mindset of people without disabilities because they're often the decision makers. They're the providers of accessibility, systems and built environments and all of that. So I would love to abolish that attitude. I don't think it'll get done completely, but that is the thing I will work on as well.
I see you projected, Ron, into focusing your services in changing in a positive way the cultural infrastructure.
Yeah.
Earlier, you worked on other kind of infrastructures, internal policies, architectural barriers, if possible, within the companies you work for. But now I can see you projected, listening to you talking about artificial intelligence, I
Yeah.
can see you projected in changing, using different tools, including artificial intelligence in positive, the cultural infrastructure.
I just shortly a while ago, I created an accessibility champion program at Royal Caribbean, and a lot of companies do this. It's like a volunteer network of people who are passionate about accessibility that are like throughout the organization. And
Mhm.
I know those people as champions, and then give them a little additional training on some of the rules and regulations, the policies. What do we offer our guests with disabilities? What do we offer our employees with disabilities? In that case, I will also look at having them become our advocates. I can't be everywhere. So it's a way to sort of clone me. It took me my entire career, Royal Caribbean, to do that program. And I said, if I were to do this over, I would start with that. Because part of the challenge and the part of the opportunity for us is to change the mindset of people without disabilities. I'm really very focused on culture change. I'm fascinated by it. Culture is one of those things that by its very definition is an intangible rules and systems. Well, if it's intangible, you can't change it. And it's really fascinating to me how that culture impacts inclusion and how do we change that culture. And it takes effort and work and conversation. And the more conversations that happen, the more that people start being mindful about people with disabilities and incorporate it into things that we do. Accessibility impacts everything. I mean, it's 15% of the population and more in some countries, and sometimes we're intentionally excluding people from either the workplace or the marketplace. So it's something to be thinking about and incorporating in everything that you do.
It proved it works because your initiatives made it possible for millions of people with autism and others to really benefit of the beauty of tourism. So, way to go. Now, I asked you quite a few questions. Now, I would like you to ask yourself a question. So, which question would you ask yourself? And what would be your answer to that question, Ron?
I will answer the question with a question.
Okay.
And part of it is my question is really around how can we make it so that people can have a vacation from their disability. And it doesn't mean that, I can't make them walk here and all that kind of stuff. And really, and I know I got called out at one point because somebody said, "Oh, I don't want my disability to be taken away from me. It's part of my identity." I get that. The goal that I'm saying is how do we make travel effortless and easy? And my answer would be how can we do that together? And so my ultimate answer to all of that, and I've answered the two questions I just put out there, really is about the work that I've been doing for years, about being collaborative and bringing people together, both with disabilities and without disabilities, and having important conversations. I also get mindful because I think we talked about this too. Sometimes collaboration takes a while. It's the very nature of our work. And sometimes, seemingly, I'm a patient person, but I'm also impatient. So I also know that corporately, everything's moving at the speed of light. And really, what we want to do is do things faster. People want to see results. They want to see inclusion moving forward. And sometimes I have to remind people about the phrase that we have in the disability community: progress over perfection,
Yeah.
right? I'm a perfectionist, but I have to realize sometimes we can be just good enough and get the product or service out there because you can't improve upon that unless you push it out there. And then you can get feedback and say what's working, what's not working, but in moving forward, sometimes they get caught up. These conversations are endless loops of trying to be perfect, and trying to design the ultimate airplane laboratory. So somewhere along the way, we'll work together to get it done. Inclusion in travel.
You
Yeah.
know, it's like learning a foreign language. I mean, my English is not perfect at all, but if I were waiting for it to be perfect, I wouldn't be talking to you at all. So we have to move step after by step by step by step to reach the objective we have in mind to the best of our abilities. So thank you very much, Ron. And would someone like to get in touch with you? They can find you in LinkedIn, I suppose, or is there another address you want to share?
No. No, LinkedIn is absolutely perfectly fine, and I love to hear from you, from everyone, and see what we can do together.
All right. Ciao, ciao. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao. Bye bye.
As I wrap up this episode, my heartfelt gratitude to today's guest and to all of you. Join me for the next episode as we delve deeper with special guests, uncovering thought-provoking insights and actionable steps, paving the way for a brighter, inclusive, sustainable tomorrow. Thanks also to Damian Morton, music, and Maria Cortez Gagliano, social media. Don't miss out next episode on shaping the future we aspire to. Ciao, ciao!